David suggested I step up here, so I'll happily do that. It's a little easier to see everybody. It's a pleasure to be on the program with all these distinguished gentlemen who have done a really fine job in this work. Uh, I'm going to try to provide a little historical perspective based on my years in government, if I can, and do that in no more than 10 minutes. And Jerry is going to slap me across the face if I go long, so I'll try to do it as quickly as I can. Uh, Most of you are too young to remember how all of this evolved, so we oldsters can come up and maybe even fib a little bit about tell war stories going back a number of years, but I'll try not to do that. We don't have time for that. But this kind of really started with the 70s when we sold grain to the Russians, because that was when we had the first wave of demand for additional food products that we hadn't experienced for a long time. And of course, farmers respond just like they always do when you give them a little incentive, and they started planting fence row to fence row in the U.S. and a lot of other countries. And then when we reached the 80s, a few years after that, all heck broke loose. We overproduced around the world. Farm prices began to collapse. We had thousands of farmers go broke here in the U.S. During that time period. And our European friends didn't help the situation any by embarking on massive export subsidies at that time to capture market share. And I can remember looking at a chart on wheat back in those years in the early 80s, in which U.S. market share was going like that, and European Union market share was going like that. So through the use of massive export subsidies, the Europeans were capturing market share at our expense, and obviously that generated a political and an economic response here in the United States. About that time in 1985, I became USTR, and then in the fall of 1986, we launched the Uruguay round, which is really where all of this is now centered. And when we went to Punta del Este to launch the Uruguay round, we had agriculture as one of our 5 U.S. priorities in the launch. And that was something new, because for all practical purposes, the GATT had done almost nothing on agriculture prior to that time. It had done a pretty good job in bringing tariff levels down through the years, but non-tariff problems had begun to emerge by that point, and nobody was doing a whole lot to curb those. And of course, then we were really worried about export subsidies. As a consequence, when the agricultural negotiations emerged in the Uruguay round, we began to focus first on export subsidy disciplines. That was the highest U.S. priority because of all the pain and suffering we were going through as a result of European Union, then called the European Economic Community, subsidies that were, in our judgment, very predatory. So that was our number one objective. And as it turned out, we were able to get some export subsidy disciplines in the Uruguay round, not major ones, but we got them on both price and quantity. We knew if we got them only on price, the European Union would slip out through the noose on quantities, and we knew if we got them only on quantities, they'd slip through the noose on price. So we had to get both price and quantity. We were able to do that. Not much discipline there, but we got it started. That became one of 3 pillars, if you will, in agricultural discipline under the WTO that have continued on since then. And in fact, in the Doha round, we've done very well with that pillar, with a commitment on the part of the European Union and the U.S., for that matter, to phase out agricultural export subsidies forever. And what a contribution that would make. So that was pillar number 1. Pillar number 2 was additional market access and trying to get some additional disciplines on non-tariff barriers. And we sought to do that through what we call tarification. In other words, converting these non-tariff barriers in agriculture to tariffs where you could get a better handle on them. We did get tarification in the Uruguay round. Unfortunately, it turned out to be dirty tarification in the eyes of the folks in the trade community, meaning that most everybody cheated in terms of how they calculated the value of those non-tariff barriers in terms of their trade distortions. So it's been a bit of a problem to deal with that issue as one of the pillars, the market access pillars, if you will, that have continued on in the WTO, and we'll have to meet those challenges further as time goes along. But now we get to what's really been the subject of all of this today, and that's the third pillar, which is domestic subsidy disciplines. And we did want to get domestic subsidy disciplines in the Uruguay round. But on this three-legged stool, export subsidies, market access, and domestic subsidy disciplines, we really felt we had to get significant progress in at least one. And our priority for the U.S. was export subsidy disciplines, if you will, more at that time than domestic subsidy disciplines. Because our strategy at that time was that if we could cut a few inches off that export subsidy stool, then the stool was going to collapse. In time at least, and we wouldn't have to worry as much about the other two legs of the stool. And fortunately, that did happen, at least to some degree. But we didn't want to forget about the domestic subsidy part of it either, because again, the European Union was spending lots of money on domestic subsidies at that time. This wasn't a major problem for us with countries like Brazil or India or China then. China wasn't even in what was then the GATT, of course. So we weren't worried about some of the things that are bothering us right now. It was mostly concerned about what the European Union was doing with their very, very large treasury and large expenditures that were not only hurting us, but hurting a lot of developing countries as well. So with domestic subsidy disciplines, I told our friends in the European Union over and over again, can't you just do a little less in the way of distorting trade? For heaven's sakes, if you want to have some subsidies, but don't distort trade to the maximum, which is what you've been doing for a long period of time. Well, that finally soaked in a little bit, not without a lot of consternation, of course, and a lot of discussion and debate with our European Union colleagues. But what ultimately emerged was what you've seen here today. Another three-legged stool, if you will, within the area of domestic subsidies. And that became the amber, blue, and green boxes that David was just talking about. Why they weren't red, yellow, and green, I'm not sure, but somehow they ended up amber, blue, and green. And as David indicated, the green box was intended to be the good stuff that you shouldn't have to worry about much in terms of trade distortions in the world. And as David has pointed out, through the years, countries have figured out a way to slip more and more stuff into the green box, considering them to be really good stuff that ought to be supported and maintained, when you might want to put a big question mark around some of that as to whether it really deserves green box categories. The blue box was sort of thrown in there to some degree at the behest of the U.S., and I wasn't there at the tail end of the Uruguay round, so I don't take credit or blame for some of these categorizations and conclusions at that time. But the fact is, the blue box, as David indicated, was intended to cover some of the programs where you had production constraints. And that was because we had all this excess production in the early 80s, so that was one of the worries. How do you keep people from producing huge amounts of stuff and then dumping them on the world market through the use of export subsidies? So you wanted to get the export subsidy disciplines, but you wanted also to get some discipline on production subsidies, and that's where this blue box category came in. And then all the bad stuff, the really trade distortive stuff, was going to be in the amber box. Now, what happened is that, and this often occurs in trade negotiations, at the end it gets fuzzed up. And this is an area that got kind of fuzzed up at the end. And you ended up with the three categories of amber, blue, and green, but then some complexities with this de minimis category and how you calculate different things. And now, of course, we have different nations have responded by finding different ways to subsidize that didn't exist back at that time. And then where do you put those categories, amber, blue, or green? And then so everybody finally figures out a way to game the system, including the U.S., of course. So we all game the system a bit and try in order to try to minimize the discipline that applies to us in this domestic subsidy area, and that is what has happened. Now, just a quick word then on follow-up. Actually, what was there was not all that bad. It was pretty good. And as David and his colleagues here have pointed out, people are thinking about these disciplines in a way that they never did before they were put in place. If you'd asked a question about any of this stuff back in 1975 or 1980, nobody would have even paid any attention. They didn't care. Now there's at least a little fear of WTO dispute settlement out there, and a little fear as to whether they have or have not done the right thing in these categorizations. I think a couple real shortcomings, though, have emerged in the follow-up to this process, and I'll just mention them quickly right now. This is covered by these gentlemen as well. One is the notification procedures. Countries are supposed to notify what they're doing in this area, and what they do is they wait about 6 or 7 years before they give their notifications. Well, it's pretty hard to implement and execute a program if you don't know what the facts are and you have no transparency. And I think that's just appalling on the part of all the member nations who have been lacking diligence in their notifications. And the U.S. is one of them. I mean, we're just as bad as anybody else in terms of the notifications. That needs more scrutiny. The Director General of the WTO ought to be screaming bloody murder about this. And the chairman of the Committee on Agriculture in the WTO ought to be screaming bloody murder about this. And there's been some really good chairmen there, too, as you know. But there's just no excuse for that lack of transparency. And then the other part of it is there really ought to be more scrutiny. When people are really deliberately and flagrantly violating the rules, somebody ought to take them to the WTO through the dispute settlement process. The WTO has a darn good dispute settlement process, the best of any international organization, period, by far, bar none. It is not perfect, but man, it's 100 times better than any other international organization, and ought to be used for situations like this where people are really gaming the system. Now, to wrap up on a somewhat positive note, clearly the groundwork has been laid here to continue to make this better and better as time goes on. I mean, the Uruguay round was the first huge improvement in this respect. And the Doha round has the possibility yet of going beyond that if we ever get the Doha round to a conclusion. And I'll quit right there. Thanks.